this on the EGNI webinar, you will find two webinars that we did earlier this year, one on what the social climate plan is, what the social climate fund is, and then we had one as well. We had Brian Caulfield in from TCD, and we had Claire from FOE also join us looking at the energy poverty and the transport poverty dimensions. So they're available on the EGNI YouTube channel as well. So just I am going to share my screen. Bear with me because I'm very bad at screen sharing. And I hope everyone can see that. Please let me know if you can't. So just very briefly, what is the Social Climate Fund? Again, important kind of context here. So each member state needs to prepare a social climate plan setting out how it intends to cushion the impacts of the ETS2, which is the new emissions trading scheme, which has implications for heating and cooling, which has implications for transport users, micro enterprises, and householders. So to avail of this fund, each member state needs to prepare a social climate plan setting out how it intends to cushion the impacts of price impacts, how it intends to support vulnerable householders, transport users, and micro enterprises, and how it intends to help shift to cleaner, kind of low carbon alternatives. So the make sure you can actually see that on the screen. Setting out what the Social Climate Fund is. Just bear with me for a second. Presuming you can't see everything else that's on my screen, and I can just actually see my notes. I lost my notes. Sorry, just a second.
Yeah, I can just see your presentation.
Okay, just a minute. Sorry, Claire and Coach, just bear with me for a minute.
You should be able to put it as a slideshow and just get the.
Would that help?
Rather
Yeah.
than getting all
Sorry.
the individuals on the left, so you get the full.
Okay. Thank you. Too many things
Yeah, if you
opening
hit
on my.
the slideshow button at the top there.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the banner. This is I have my Zoom banner. Gosh. Okay, I hope that makes a difference. Okay.
It did revert, but it's reverted back again.
Okay, I might just keep it if that's okay, so I can move on, and then what I'll do is I'll share these slides after the session. So what the SCP is essentially, it's the national framework that needs to translate the fund's goals, reducing the impact of ETS2 into targeted practical measures. So for Ireland, the potential allocation here is around 663 million in EU funding over a period of time. I think it's between 2026 and 2032. That's kind of the window, that's the envelope. And that's from I think the overall for all member states is around 1.4 billion. So that's kind of the pot of money that's available. Just a little bit at the moment in terms of the EU and the kind of political context. So it's worth noting that at the moment, some countries are openly opposing ETS2 and by extension, the Social Climate Fund. And there is political pressure in parts of Europe to kind of weaken, delay, or shrink the scope of ETS2. There are also concerns that the SCF may kind of drift away from its social purpose, and that under the current budget proposals for 2028 to 2035, that the Commission might fold the fund into broader headings on competitiveness and resilience. And if that happens, it might mean that member states could repurpose the money from vulnerable households, kind of targeted spending into more general spending. So that's a risk for everyone kind of working on social justice. What it means is that, we need to emphasize that the fund needs to be ring fenced for people that are most affected by the kind of carbon costs. Just Kira quite mentioned the consultation a little bit just in terms of the Irish context. So Ireland was due to submit its SCP social climate plan to the Commission by the 30th of June of this year. But like most member states, it is late. The consultation runs for 6 weeks, so until October 23rd. It takes the form of an online survey, and perhaps some of you have already filled it in. And that survey comprises ranking questions and kind of text box for comments. You are asked to rank indicative measures and rank kind of target groups. Just one note, so from my reading, some of what they're asking actually falls out of the scope of the SCF regulation. So, for example, they ask on one of the ranking questions about using the SCF to turn vacant and derelict commercial properties into social housing for vulnerable households. And that's fine, but it actually falls out of the scope of the SCF. So just I think there's a couple of places, not all throughout the survey, but there are a couple of the measures that they propose that you have to rank, and they're not actually relevant to the SCF scope. I don't know why they've done that. I'm not sure if it's intentional, or if it's just an error on their part, or perhaps my reading is wrong. But I think has been an error there. The rest of the survey, then you have to prioritize vulnerable groups. You have to prioritize the measures that you think groups should receive. You can provide feedback. Again, there are kind of character limits, so just watch it on that. And you can provide additional comments, and you can also email in your response to the department as well, which is what we did. What's unusual here, and I think this should be called out when you submit your response, is that we haven't actually seen a draft plan. So they've published a survey, but they haven't actually sent a draft plan to accompany that survey. And looking at other member states that have also opened their consultation, they have made a draft plan available. So we're being asked to comment really without seeing the plan itself, which means we can't really evaluate two things. We can't assess whether Ireland's plan complies with the Social Climate Fund regulation, and we can't assess whether it genuinely protects the people that are most affected by rising energy and transport costs. On the department website, consultation website, you'll see that they say that they will hold one public event with the European Commission present to present the draft. But interestingly, in the Commission's guidance on public participation, they make it clear that a single survey or an event at the end of drafting is, and using their words, is likely to add limited value. So in our submission, we do ask the government or the department to publish a full draft SCP immediately, not just at a public event. We also ask that they hold on to the 6-week window. So currently the consultation is for 6 weeks, which is better than the normal 4 weeks we see. But we need to see a draft in addition to that 6-week window. And that we need to see a consultation process that doesn't just cover kind of a list of measures, but also includes what their definitions of vulnerability are, the targeting methods that they'll be using, information around co-financing, monitoring, and then the links with other policy frameworks. The timing is quite important here. So Ireland is late. Member states that submitted their plans by June 2025, they will begin receiving funds ideally in 2026. So for Ireland, the earliest possible drawdown of funds is now kind of mid 2026, only after the Commission has actually approved the plan. So that makes it, I think, important that we get a credible plan in straight away, whilst also allowing for that proper consultation time, so that the funds can be available, you know, ideally before the end of 2026. If not, you know, there's a likelihood that we're going to be going into 2027 before we can draw down funds. So just another bit of important kind of context information. So Ireland has applied for a derogation. This is all slightly complicated, but Ireland has applied for a derogation from the ETS2 until 2030, on the basis that our national carbon tax already covers heating and transport fuels. What's important to remember here is that that doesn't exempt us at all from our obligations under the SCF regulations. So we still need to prepare. We can still draw down from the fund. We still need to prepare a climate plan like every other member state. So the derogation, it changes the timing, but it doesn't change the responsibility. What we've argued in our submission is that this time needs to be used as it's a kind of opens up a strategic window. And what we need to do here is pilot really strong socially climate targeted measures. We need to improve the data here around vulnerability. We need to improve the delivery capacity. And we need to prepare for a full ETS2 participation after 2030. And I think with that, then we need to see, considering that Ireland is relying on its national carbon tax system, we need to see how the carbon tax currently affects vulnerable households and transport users and small businesses, and then how the SCF money will complement, not duplicate national spending of the carbon tax revenue. And just an important point, the European Commission in their assessment of Ireland's National Energy and Climate Plan flagged that we lack kind of an analytical basis for identifying who's vulnerable, and we lack information then on how carbon revenues are used. And this is something that they'll want to see in the social climate plan. I probably should pause there, and if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand or any comments.
There's
Before
a
I quickly move
question,
on.
Catherine, in the chat column asks, are other countries late as well, which I think is an important question.
Yeah,
This is-
thanks for that, column. So the majority of other EU member states are late. I think only one or two have actually submitted, submitted on time. So most are late. I think what's important here, though, is that most have already opened their public consultation, and most have already drafted a plan as part of that consultation process. So I think, if we kind of emphasize the late part, the department will quickly say, well, they're not the only ones that are late. But I do think the failure to have actually provided a draft plan as part of the public consultation process is the issue here. Just to note as well, EGNI, and I'm sure other organizations here present have reached out to the relevant officials to discuss the development of the plan. We did that. We never had the opportunity, so our requests were declined. Interestingly, I heard from other NGOs in other member states who said that they had kind of an ongoing active engagement with the relevant officials to help feed into the development of the draft and into the consultation process. And that's something that unfortunately we haven't seen here. So it will be interesting to see what form the public event, what form that will take, and how they intend to make it kind of inclusive as possible. So yeah. Any other questions or comments before I move on?
Yeah. So Emer raises the question, is there a good practice example of a member state that does have a good analytical basis for identifying who's vulnerable?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I should have said that I can't answer every question now, but what I will do is just keep a note of the questions, and I'm happy to do a little bit of research and then provide that in an email response if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And okay, any other questions? Sorry, I can't actually see the chat.
No, I think that's us for now, and then we can have another question session at the
Yeah.
end. A quick one.
Okay, so just moving on then very quickly. Again, this is kind of recap, but I think it's really important because, I think when you go to answer the consultation as organizations, you'll have your own kind of priorities as to what you want to identify and focus on. But I think what's really important here are the principles of the SCF regulation. So in other words, the principles of what should be in the social climate plan. So it's not just about the policy measures. It's also about the kind of the architecture around those measures. So that's really, really important. So just again, very briefly, what the SCP must legally contain. So again, what we need to see is a plan that's evidence-based. So we need to see those national patterns of vulnerability, where the carbon cost will hit the hardest across housing, transport. Again, really important is the transport side. And then we need to see those specific kind of measurable targets. The focus needs to be on long-term structural change. So it's not just about short-term relief, but it's about tackling the root causes of energy and transport poverty. Fourth then is around kind of temporary income support. So temporary income support is allowed, but only as a transitional bridge to structural measures. And there is a funding limit of around 37% for direct income supports. And then again, then there needs to be detail on costs and co-financing. The co-financing is really important here. So member states are obliged to co-finance, I think a minimum is around 25%. So there needs to be that detail. I mean, the SCF envelope fund is actually quite small. So there needs to be that co-financing detail included. There needs to be gender equality and inclusion. There needs to be a robust monitoring framework, and we need to see alignment then with state aid rules, with European Pillar of Social Rights, with the building and renovation plan. So a number of kind of other EU policy frameworks, there needs to be alignment and coherence. And importantly, the measures need to comply with the do no significant harm principle. Just then again, that's all included in the slides that I'm happy to circulate. So we published a briefing document earlier this year on the 6 priorities. These are kind of the high-level priorities that need to be in the plan, and we used this as the basis of our submission last week. So priority number 1, policy credibility and early action. So even despite Ireland requesting a derogation from the ETS2 from the Commission, the plan still needs to align with the FCF's overall purpose of addressing the social and distributional impacts of carbon pricing. The derogation, we believe, should be used as an opportunity to front load investment in clean heat, retrofitting and transport. And we also believe that there needs to be a commitment to review and adjust the plan by 2029 to prepare fully then for the ETS2 implementation post 2030. In terms then of identifying and targeting vulnerability. Now, this is kind of a big one because I know there are gaps, and I do wonder if this is one of the reasons why the department has been quite late in putting together a draft. So vulnerability, first of all, and I think we all know this, needs to be understood or approached as a multi-dimensional issue, not just explained in terms of income or access to income. So we need to see that kind of multi-dimensional translated within the plan. And that needs to be backed up by the data. Within the consultation, they do ask about prioritization. Who do you want to prioritize in terms of vulnerable groups? And we have proposed a kind of a tiered prioritization for targeting because of the emphasis on targeting and vulnerability. Um, so tier A, for example, in our consultation, highest priority are social housing tenants, our rural households in terms of access to transport, are kind of those that are experiencing maybe complex health needs that might amplify their risk in terms of exposure to transport poverty and to energy poverty, so people with disabilities or health critical energy needs, for example. Tier B would be low income owner occupiers or vulnerable micro enterprises. Tier C, for example, might be general kind of transport users, important but sequenced after structural housing and energy fixes. So I encourage you to jump in and see what we've said there, just on the data side, because I do think this is quite important. So, when it comes to identifying vulnerability, I think Ireland already has a lot of data. It's probably just not used in a coordinated way. So in our response, we make the point that some data is available, for example, like BER data, income data, census data on housing. I'm sure there is transport data, and then there's all the administrative information kind of data. But our understanding is that this data is quite fragmented across different agencies, and perhaps the coverage isn't complete, for example, and data sets, access to data sets is quite restricted. And things like, transport cost burdens are not systematically measured. I think that's a huge gap understanding transport poverty in Ireland. So there are big gaps. Um, but what the social climate plan needs to do is actually commit to developing and publishing a national vulnerability map. That's in the SCF regulation. But at the same time, we probably can't wait until every data set on vulnerability is perfect. So I think what we've called for in our response is that we should use what we have now to create kind of a baseline picture and then refine and update as the new data comes in. And that's actually in line with well, first of all, what the regulation says is that when you submit your plan, there does need to be an identification and an estimation of the number of vulnerable householders, transport users, and so on when the plan is submitted. But at the same time, the Commission do say that the plan can be iterative. So in the sense that it can be updated. So I think when you are making the submission, I think it's fair to say or acknowledge the data gaps, but there does need to be a commitment to address those gaps with a view to improving the plan over time once improved data and more comprehensive data is gathered. Just then on priority 3, we call for a strengthened implementation capacity. And this probably comes from our understanding of the Just Transition Fund. Again, a pot of money made available, but because of gaps in actually administering that money, that it means that the full pot hasn't actually been utilized. So again, missed opportunity. So what we call for is a dedicated SCF delivery unit that will coordinate between departments and in terms of the data side. Within the fund, there's a 2.5% administrative cap, so we call for national co-funding to support that. We call for enhanced local authority capacity, regional one-stop shops. We also call for a monitoring committee that will include local government, but also civil society, those that are actually working closest with those who are most vulnerable. And then regular publication of progress and milestones. We also called then for the structural measures, the milestones, the targets, and I think a lot of you will be familiar with this, so I probably don't need to go into too much detail. So, deep retrofits, we argue for social housing first. On transport, again, emphasis on rural transport, not just in terms of affordability, but also accessibility and shared mobility. We don't give as much priority to EV incentives because of the emphasis on, or the risk of kind of locking in car dependency. So again, you look out for that when it comes to filling in the survey. And then also just an emphasis on, funding kind of demand responsive shared mobility options, and prioritizing public and shared solutions over kind of private EV grants. Um, I think again quite important. Claire, did you want to just come in here and say anything on the energy poverty kind of housing side? If that's okay, I'll bring you in.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, hi guys, I'm Claire. I'm Friends of the Earth program coordinator for heat, so I look at energy poverty and energy efficiency. We haven't made our submission yet, the social climate plan, and just well done to EJ and I for being so on it and all your work so far. So it's been really great. With regards to the energy efficiency measures, it is really positive to see a focus on social housing, and that probably will also be our number one priority there. As well as that, it is quite positive to see the focus on the one-stop shop, kind of, they call them energy efficiency information hubs, which is kind of what we've been calling for with regards to community energy advice services. So there is some good stuff in there. They are lacking when it comes to the private rental sector massively, and we will be flagging that because we've seen over the last few years that households in the private rental sector have, I think they're 3 times more likely to be in energy poverty, but there's been no targeted supports for them at all. And we've kind of seen them left out again in the social climate plan consultation, unfortunately. So we will be flagging that. What else? I think the focus on vulnerable households in older energy poor buildings as well. So really targeting the worst performing first will be one of our priorities. Again, like I think all of these have to happen together. Like, I think one can't happen without the other. So you can't have like lots of money going towards retrofitting without having these kind of supports like the energy advice centres to actually help people with that. So it is tricky, I think, to have to prioritise these, but our priorities will be social housing, the worst performing buildings, and then getting the community energy advice services, while also making it really clear that they've, again, deprioritised renters in particular.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Claire. And I think your point about the one-stop shops is really interesting. I'll come to that just in terms of our kind of key takeaways. Again, I think it is, when you are making a submission, it's really important to make the point about the co-financing, because all of these measures require a lot of investment. So I think reminding the department that there is the 25% mandatory co-financing requirement. But I think there's a huge opportunity to go beyond. I mean, I was reading yesterday about how much our fossil fuel subsidies have increased, I think, since 2021. It's, the CSO information, it's all there. And it's quite, I mean, it's mind-boggling. So I think there's plenty of opportunities to look at like how we can redirect harmful subsidies into much more green investment, but particularly green investment that's targeted at those that are most vulnerable. And I think that probably applies for the carbon tax revenue as well. I'm not entirely clear like how targeted the revenue generation is from the carbon tax revenue, but I don't believe it's targeted as much as it could be. So I think there's plenty of opportunity there. Claire, so you have your hand up.
No, I was just going to comment in on that carbon tax point, because research came out last year that showed they could only verify that 61% of the carbon tax revenue was spent on targeted initiatives between 2020 and 2023. So we're going to also call for a need for legislation to ring fence that carbon tax, and also a call for transparency as to how carbon tax is spent and making sure that it's going to the right places.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, Claire. And again, just to go back to what the Commission said in its NECP assessment, that there needs to be greater information on the link, and particularly now if Ireland is saying, well, we have a carbon tax, and because of that we're requesting the derogation from the ETS2 until 2030. I think it creates an even greater onus on the need for that level of transparency in terms of where the revenue, how the revenue is being recycled, where it's going, and is it being targeted, and particularly targeted towards those that are most vulnerable. Just moving on, because I'm really, really conscious of time, and probably just take more questions. So our priority 5 then is just then around the time limited income support. So the regulation allows for 37.5% of funds for direct income support, but these supports need to be temporary and transitional. So in our response, we said that, potential here to deliver through the existing kind of welfare system, but consider branding these supports as a climate bonus or a carbon dividend, to help build kind of public trust in how money is being used, and in how it's being used in a way that's aiming to support those that are most vulnerable. And then linking income supports, temporary income supports, to kind of long-term pathways, so that recipients are offered kind of guidance and maybe hand-holding into those kind of structural measures. The 6th priority then is aligning with Ireland's broader kind of social and climate goals. Again, a requirement that the SCP needs to align with the European Pillar of Social Rights. It needs to, for example, have a focus on creating sustainable jobs. It needs to coordinate with things like the Just Transition Fund, like Ireland's National Energy and Climate Plan, for example, with carbon tax revenues. I mean, I suppose the issue here for me is that our National Energy and Climate Plan was had a series of significant gaps. So it's hard to align something with something that was far from ideal and didn't comply fully with the regulation either. But again, I think it's an important point to make, that there is that alignment with broader goals. I'm going to move on very quickly just in terms of our 6 key takeaways. So we ended our consultation with the following points, which again you might like to take on board. So we said to the department that the consultation is too narrow. We engaged, of course, with the online survey, but for us it lacked an opportunity for kind of meaningful public content. We didn't include the draft plan itself. We didn't see any kind of information on vulnerability analysis, targets, co-financing information, for example. And without that information, we can't actually assess whether it's compliant or whether it will actually protect vulnerable groups. And I'm not sure how we can be expected to do that at a public event. So I suppose in the absence of a draft, we can only assume that, this is just a tick box exercise, and unfortunately not a genuine consultation. So it's worth, I think, calling that out in your consultation submissions. Takeaway number 2, timing here really, really matters. And I think, a delay doesn't necessarily mean lost support. So obviously Ireland hasn't submitted its draft yet. We're looking now at mid-2026 as being the earliest for when they can draw down the funds. That's presuming the Commission will approve the plan. But if drafting drags on, payments may slip into 2027. So, that's another winter of vulnerability exposure. But of course, we need to get the timing right with sufficient publication, with a sufficient consultation, and with a credible plan, credible, comprehensive plan. So I think our message here is act fast, but act right. And that speed can't necessarily replace substance, I think, in this case. Our third takeaway is that we need to show that the plan is well funded. So the SCF alone won't be enough. That needs to be acknowledged, and we need to see that Ireland is committed to go beyond the 25% minimum national co-financing. We also need to see that the SCF is not rebadging existing budgets. It can't do that. That's not in line with the regulation. So what we've called for is a transparent financing table showing how the SCF money is going to combine with the carbon tax revenues, how it's going to combine with the other funds that we have access to, and how it's going to safeguard or how it's going to avoid double accounting. We make the point that the evidence base for targeting is weak, that right now we don't necessarily have a strong analytical basis for who is vulnerable, and the SCF or the SCP must fill that gap. And we can fill that gap with what we have available now, but there must be a commitment to go further with filling that gap in terms of understanding who is vulnerable, what causes their vulnerability, and then how we can address that vulnerability with targeted measures. And it must be mapped across housing, it must be mapped across tenure, it must be mapped across geography. That's called for, that's recommended in terms of the guidance from the Commission. It must be mapped across social groups. And of course, it must be mapped for the micro enterprises as well. We also then call for that partnering with local authorities, and with the groups that are on the ground, the advocacy groups that are on the ground, working with vulnerable communities and households on an everyday basis, and that understand their context and their needs. The fifth takeaway then, investment in the implementation capacity. If weak delivery is one of our biggest risks, I think, with this. So we need to have the kind of administrative architecture put in place to ensure that the money actually gets drawn down and actually gets delivered. And as part of that, then Claire mentioned the one-stop shops. And I think this is really interesting. I was reading research last week on transport poverty, and it shows that, even if that most households don't actually self-apply for retrofit or mobility schemes, even if they know that they can save money. So you may know that you save money, but you don't necessarily go to seek out what's available. So I think many simply also don't know what is available, or they don't necessarily trust the process, or they can't manage the paperwork. And we hear this all the time. So, we make the point in our submission that perfect targeting on paper isn't enough, and that the SCP needs to work with trusted intermediaries. So the one-stop shops, the anti-poverty networks, the organizations, again, that are on the ground, to assist with the outreach and the hand-holding. And of course, then, that type of work, though, that kind of on-the-ground intervention needs to be properly funded and supported. Just finally, and apologies for time, focus on the structural solutions. Again, the structural long-term measures, and then the temporary income supports as a bridge, not as a crutch. And then finally, then aligning then with the broader kind of social climate goals as required by the regulation. So I've covered a lot. Please do jump into we've published a lot on this, as I mentioned at the beginning, our webinars on the EGNI YouTube channel. We have some briefing documents on EGNI website. Under publications, you'll find them. But most importantly, for the submission, you'll see our consultation document. There's loads in there, which hopefully will find helpful. And then our 6 priorities document, which is kind of the high level principles that need to be in the SCP. And I hope you'll find that useful as well. So they're all on the EGNI website. So stop sharing, and we have a little bit of time do we have time for a Q&A, Caught? Hopefully we do.
Yeah, we obviously are over the 45 minutes, but if everyone's keen to stay on for, another couple of minutes, we're happy to do that. But yeah, Louise has put into the chat here that Louise, actually, if you just want to jump on here and ask the question.
Yeah, absolutely happy to do that. So I am based in Fingal, the Fingal area, and I spoke to local council recently, especially actually after your webinar last week. I found it really interesting talking about retrofitting and buy-in from people. And she mentioned that Fingal themselves have found it really difficult to get people to buy into retrofitting. I don't know if you have the stats on that especially within that local authority, but what she had said was in and around 90 houses last year were retrofitted. Again, I don't have the evidence or the stats behind me. I just even thought, like, anecdotally, if you heard it, they heard this. So it would have been areas around Blanchardstown where they tried to retrofit and they found it very difficult for the residents to buy in.
Tara, do you want to answer that one, or do you have any?
Yeah, I can come in on that. Yeah, we have anecdotally heard of a lot of that as well, that there's like a lack of trust there. There's a lack of awareness, but some of the distrust in a way is somewhat validated, because a lot of houses, what we're hearing, that are getting heat pumps aren't actually getting support with managing the heat pumps afterwards. So there's a real fear with this new technology on how to use it. Will it make my bills more expensive? We've been calling for a long time is this kind of post-occupancy support. So after you get your retrofit done, that there's actually someone there to help you with the heat pump and managing it all. And I think there's a huge amount of funding going into retrofitting these days, but there isn't enough to actually like doing it. But there isn't enough funding going into the people element. And that's why we're calling for like community energy advisors to actually talk to people and help them understand it. Because I think otherwise it's very, I think, kind of scary to have a new technology coming into your house, and there's a lot of misinformation going around then about it as well. So there's just people need a face-to-face person that they can talk, and there needs to be kind of almost peer support around it as well. I think I heard a place down in Kerry that did it, and they had set up like a WhatsApp group for everyone in the area who was going through the retrofitting, and seemingly that was really, really helpful. It's such a like small low tech intervention, but having that peer support is really significant, I think.
Yeah, thanks for answering that.
Yeah, really, it's really interesting. So I think, Louise, if you do, maybe you've already made a submission, but if you do make the submission, really make that point that it is, like, as Claire said, it's the peer-to-peer. It's kind of being on the ground. It's not just about providing information kind of top down and expecting it to kind of infiltrate through.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I don't know if you've seen the articles recently, even about the heat pump that's been recalled through thousands and thousands of houses. I'm actually a local authority tenant with Fingal, and we got a letter that they were coming out to service boilers, but I'm in an electric only house, like we only have electric heaters. So I think even with that, Fingal just done a blanket postal, like a drop off to everybody, not kind of really looking at what heating systems are in people's homes, is because I'm part of the tenant in situ scheme, so I'm not in like a council estate.
Yeah.
But thanks for the feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Louise.
Just as well. So if you are, so when you go into the survey, like, first of all, you might pop in and then pop out. And I found that when I did that, I'd had to go back and complete it again. And I also made another area. So they ask, I think one of the first open comments, you don't realize you're limited to 500 words, I think it was, until you actually start kind of filling it out. So I'd filled out this massive essay on a separate document, and then went to paste it in and realized, well, like, this has to be 500 words. So you might find, like, they do say email us in as well. So if you find that the survey is too restrictive, or if there's more you want to say, just do email them in. And I do think, like, Louise, your experiences of being, like, you're on the ground, I think that's really, really helpful, because you're hearing direct from these things directly on the ground. So it's really good.
Yeah, so we have another question here, which is of similar vein. Emer asks, do you have any advice for filling out the consultation for specific groups we're interested in submitting our consultation advocating for vulnerable youth? I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like, because this came up in a previous webinar last week, but if you have, like, same as Louise was saying there, on the ground experience, like that you want to they want to share through this consultation, the real life advocacy of what's happening in energy poverty and transport poverty on the ground, like use this consultation to capture that. And obviously we have like Catherine's done an amazing submission, and there's like a really like good framework there for anyone to base their submission off of. But if you feel, like there, if you want to advocate specifically from the perspective of vulnerable youth, then like definitely do that. But correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think, and I'd say, Emer, like I'm just looking at your comment, and like the one thing for me here is around transport poverty, and I don't know if Colin is still with us, but like I feel, you know, we're energy poverty is getting focus. It's not getting probably as much focus as it needs to get, of course. But I just feel transport poverty is such a gap in Ireland, and like probably even from an advocacy perspective. So I imagine for a lot of vulnerable youth, you know, they probably don't have a car. Uh, and not that transport poverty is defined by whether or not you have a car. It's not. It's so much more than that. But I would think like what's really impacting your particular group here. And I would strongly encourage, if you can certainly say something about transport poverty and how that impacts like youth participation in society, access to university, like we're hearing about long commuter times, irregular commuter time, you know, trying to access because of the housing crisis. So it's also multidimensional. But it's, you know, transport poverty is really about, and Brian Caulfield made this point, it's about your inability to actually participate fully in society. So I think really you might want to just push, I'm encouraging you to push the point around transport poverty. I don't know if you want to add anything to that column while we have you here.
Yeah, no. Look, for me, my background is as a civil engineer, and as I said in the chat there, with like I'm used to just throwing in lots of submissions to consultations in relation to proposals on the ground, you know, and infrastructure and stuff like that. So this is it's a bigger task. Now, there's a few of us are actually going to be working behind the scenes on this, and it's just fantastic. The whole transport, we got the resource of the European Cyclists Federation, which is a wider, you know, they're dealing on the European level, and they're feeding also into some of the stuff that we're doing. And of course, transport poverty will be a big part of what we are putting together in our submission. But it's just look what AJ and I have put together, as far as I've read so far, is just, for me and for us as an organization, it's a fantastic resource, and it's just great to have that as a. I mean, I just commend you so much in terms of this, because you know we're coming late to the story here. 23rd of October, very short. Like let's face it, and getting head around a very big subject. It's a difficult one. I'm sure a lot of people even on this webinar are probably in the same box as well, of just trying to make sure that what we say makes somewhat of a difference. I mean, we've just gone through a budget where we have been pushing certain things to try to happen, but of course very little actually did happen in terms of transport, in terms of what we would call active travel. But it has held its own. But that was after meeting with officials and meeting with the minister himself and meeting with, you know, so sometimes these things just seem to take so much on the ground work and so many bodies that need to get, and then getting people's ears. And as you say, I mean, I think it's a bloody disgrace what has happened in relation to this, the SCF and the officialdom, and you know that we are so late to the game. That the as you say, the SCF, the plan for Ireland has not been published, the draft plan. What? I'm sorry, I'm ranting on here, but look, we certainly will be covering all of those issues.
Thanks so much, Colin. And like, you know, EJ and I, we went through this last year with the National Energy and Climate Plan, again, late. And so, you know, we're not surprised that the plan is late. And unfortunately, sometimes the fact that other member states have also submitted theirs late can be a get off the hook. But I think, at this point, being late risks drawing down from the fund in a timely manner. I've just put a link in the chat to research that that a guy called Christopher Lowens did. I see he co-authored with Brian Caulfield, and I think it's open access, but it's what causes energy and transport poverty in Ireland. And I particularly found the transport piece kind of really, really interesting. So again, if you're particularly doing anything on transport for this mission, you might like to just jump into the article and see what he says. But he very much strongly advocates for the need for a much more proactive approach to encouraging people to avail of incentives and so on.
Yeah, thanks a million.
I think we'll just have time for one more, and then we might have to wrap this up. But Deirdre from Friends of the Earth, yes, mentioned that Pobal, if I'm saying that right, have access to wonder Pobal has access to some of the data we need, and is someone working on bridging these data sets. I know they released a really good article recently with UCD, in regards to like renewable energy uptake in vulnerable households, but. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have the answer, Deirdre. I don't know if you want to come in, Deirdre.
Hi, Catherine. Sorry, I'm just showing my face there. I was listening intently, but keeping warm. Thanks a million for the presentation. Yeah, I'm just wondering whether, because I know I was talking to a few people who were doing a lot of bridging on data sets around socioeconomic and environmental. So I don't know, but I wonder, is it just worth this group putting the feeders out to see if anyone, who could be in an academic institution that we're just not in contact with is actually bridging some of that. Because as you said, I think it's part of our challenge, isn't it? Is having kind of not even universal data, because we don't want to be uniform, but having a truth around who is experiencing certain parts of poverty and why. I know that Pobal have done some background data analysis in relation to climate and the environment. I don't know if you have, like, that you wouldn't necessarily see up front in their materials. And they obviously produce that really good report in renewables as well. So I might reach out to them, the guy that I know who'd mentioned it to me, and just see, and then I can share it back in here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and I make the data is a big thing here. Well, because it's required by the regulation, but also it's required to ensure that the measures are targeted, sufficiently targeted. And as I said, I do think that's probably the reason, or one of the main reasons why we haven't seen the draft yet. But at the same time, as mentioned, we can acknowledge the difficulties and the gaps and commit to addressing, because there is that living document sense to the SCP. So, as long as there is a commitment to address and then actually address, as we continue to draw then funds between now and 2030. But I'm hoping that, like, the Commission, so similar to the NECP, the department needs to submit kind of progress reports, I think every 2 years. I'm hoping that within the Commission that there will be a kind of a strong enough correction mechanisms to address any of those gaps. I mean, we haven't necessarily seen it very strongly within the NECP process. So I imagine it might be the same for the SCP. Let's see. And of course, a lot of this will depend on how the conversation goes regarding the current EU budget proposals over the coming years.
So, Catherine, that living element to it, sorry, just a very quick follow-up, is that like progressive realization? Is that kind of similar to that concept? Or a bit
Tell me
different?
more about that concept.
Sorry, it's a human rights concept around socioeconomic rights. So there you're progressively realizing, and you never retrograde. Do you know what I mean? So you're always moving forward, and you're not going backwards, but you don't have to get to the final destination straight away.
Well, I think the reality is that the Social Climate Fund regulation sets out very, very clearly like what needs to be in the plan. what needs to be in your social climate plan. So there's only probably so much scope available to saying we don't have this data, we're going to get this data. So I think, but at the same time, there is this kind of a narrative process which happens behind the scenes between member states and the Commission. And I mean, that's currently happening. We met with the Commission, a number of us from other European NGOs met with the Commission, I think a couple of weeks ago, and they talked about being constantly or regularly in touch with member states around the drafting of the SCP. So, but I think what we need to see, we can see an acknowledgement, but then we need to see a very clear commitment that we're going to address the gaps explicitly. And I would even like timelines as well and milestones around that.
Okay, I think that's us. Catherine, if you think we're ready to wrap up. Yeah, so thank you all for attending, and those who stayed the extra 15 minutes to let us talk through some questions, which I think is always important. And we will send around all the relevant, including Catherine's slides and previous resources and previous webinars. We'll send that around to all attendees just so that you're fully informed before you make your submission, or you're advising other groups or organizations to make a submission as well. So yes, thank you so much, and I hope you all have a great day, great rest of the day.